Hello, again. So in my first story, it was about the young man growing up in the forest. I think I told that story, I wanted to tell that story because it reminds me of my dad's. It's a bit like my dad's story, in that my dad was born in a little country little house, a little cottage at the end of country lane, and my mum was born in the house next door, little house next door, and they grew up. They were born and grew up and got married, and presumably fell in love in the meantime. I'm never entirely sure about that. And but they got married, and they had the house built, the farm. We all live in a little farm, the farmhouse, built in the cottage, in the orchard behind my grandparents' house, and we've lived there ever since. So in 3 generations, my family have moved about 20 metres backwards, and our farm is called Sandiago. It wasn't meant to be called Sandiago, it was meant to be called Sandiacre. But when my parents had the house built, the sign came back from the sign writers wrong. They weren't sign writers as much as sign wrongers, but if they called them that, they wouldn't have got the work, I'm sure. It's called Sandiago now, but it was meant to be called Sandiacre. But the farm's not sandy, and it's more than an acre, so the whole farm naming business was fraught with complications. So my dad and my mum built up the farm over many years, buying it one field at a time. Because back in the 1940s and 1950s, I think it was still the case then, that every little cottage in the Forest of Dean had an orchard behind it, or a little field, a paddock for some sheep or some cows, or a little sty for some pigs, and kept some chicken in the backyard and everything. And my dad, every 12 months or something, he wasn't a big drinker, but he'd go down to the Rising Sun pub, which is the local on Wollaston Common. It was called the Rising Sun because that was the first thing the customers would notice upon leaving. And my dad would find himself standing next to one of his neighbours at the bar, and quite casually, and he'd say, "Oh, Joe, I noticed your orchard's got a few thistles and weeds going in. Why don't I buy it off you, and your life would be easy, and I'd have be able to make the farm a little bit bigger." And they'd shake hands on it, and that's how my dad bought a meadow for our cows from Mr. Cow Meadow, and he brought that makes it sound too twee to be true. The cry of dyslexic owl, and so he bought it ground from Mr. Turnaround Jones, and it was our neighbour. Mr. Turnaround Jones got his name because his dad was called Mr. Jones. That explains the laughter half of it. But Mr. Jones was called Mr. Jones because Turnaround Jones was called that because when talking about a conversation he'd had down the Rising Sun, he'd say, "Well, I turned around and he said this, and then he turned around and he said that." So you can imagine everybody in the Rising Sun turning around constantly during the course of the conversation. So my dad, they'd shake hands, and my dad would buy a small paddock, and then he'd go to the Lydney Lloyd's, and he'd take out a loan against his salary at the Lydney train station. He worked in the Southern Box, and my sister and me are paying back the last bit of money we owed the bank by selling each field back to the grandchildren of the people we bought it off 60 years ago. So what a complete waste of time.